Hey, good morning, folks, and welcome to another segment of the Cold Hard Truth. Thank you guys so much for tuning in today. Welcome one and welcome all. I see we've got over 50 persons already tuned in. We've got a special show for you. Well, every show, as far as I'm concerned, is special, but I am very tickled pink to have a special guest with us in the studio today. And of course, this entire week, we're going to have what I think are amazing guests who are going to help us dig a little bit deeper into understanding our own Caymanian history, who you are, where we come from, all those wonderful things. Because as I said on the onset of yesterday's program, having that historical context and understanding where we have come from and what our history is not only represents our future and where we're going, but it helps us, I personally think, to have a greater appreciation for the diversity that we do have. And of course, we see at this particular time, there are, riots across the world. I mean, every single country almost in the world, with the exception of Cayman, is, I don't want to use the word rioting, but protesting, because the rioters are in a minority. And of course, they're not the ones who, we want to put up on a pedestal, although I must say they appear to be playing a part in this process. And we're going to talk about some of those things a little bit later on, probably in this evening show. So, as you guys know, Tuesdays and Thursday evenings, we do have a 1 hour evening program. So, we'll get into some of the other things. There's a quick announcement by the World Health Organization about asymptomatic people maybe not passing on the coronavirus as much as we think. So we will delve into that report a little bit later on this evening and see where the World Health Organization is actually obtaining that information from. But good morning, Jennifer. Good morning, Olivia. Good morning to all of you. And a special good morning to our guest, Mr. Roy Bodden. Good morning, Mr. Roy. How are you?
Sandra, I'm doing fine, and I have to ask you to excuse me at about 8 o'clock because I have a prior commitment. But I'm doing fine, and I'm
Okay,
here at your.
not a problem.
Yes, I'm humbled for you to receive your invitation.
Well, we certainly are humbled to have you here, and we will use every single minute of that time. So, good morning, Mr. Roy, Lorna, Olivia, Jennifer, everyone who's tuned in says good morning to you. Um, Let us just delve right in. Can you tell us now? You are a Bodden, and we were looking at some historical documents on last week. I believe it was Friday, that had some of the original families listed back in the early days, early settlers, so to speak. And it was really interesting to see a lot of the names that obviously we continue to see today. And Bodden is at the top of the list. And of course, we know that the Boddens were such a prominent family that Bodden town was named after the Bodden family, and that used to be the capital of the Cayman Islands. So tell us a little bit about what do you know about the Boddens, generally speaking, and specifically about your own lineage.
Okay, well, I trace my ancestry back to the very early days of settlement, as you have said, particularly settlement in Bodden town. And I got somebody shared with me the family tree some years ago, and I was surprised. I mean, my mother told me a lot of things, but I was surprised to find out that I got this document that all the Boddens in Bodden town, had, my side came from a common ancestor. And so I have this document. I shared it with some of my other family members, and it gave me a source of pride. Now, I have come to understand that what happened, because we had primarily domestic slavery, is that the black people often took the names of their owners, the surnames of their owners. African people, as many people many of your listeners may realize or may not realize, had only one name. They didn't have surnames. The business of surnames was a European name. So you had Africans like Primus, Hannibal, and all those were male names. Satira, which was my great grandmother, but they had no surname.
Mm.
So I would suspect, people always ask me, well, you're a Bodden, and they have white Boddens and brown Boddens and black Boddens. How did that come about? I would suspect that somewhere along the line, my ancestors worked for slaveholders whose names were Bodden. And so the early people just took that surname. Now, what is quite interesting with my own family of Boddens, my paternal grandfather was a very prominent person in Bodden town. And I was surprised. Of course, all of us Caymanians are mixed. That is why I say there is no pure white Caymanian and there is no pure black Caymanian. From the mere fact that it was domestic slavery, and slavery was the kind of institution which had very loose and open boundaries when it came to miscegenation and sex. So that yeah, that is briefly the history. I don't know. I know that my paternal grandfather had family in East End, and I know also that we had family in Georgetown. So it makes for a very interesting mix. But when I was growing up, Boddens were much more prominent than they are now. Of course, what I call Caymanian surname now is not as prominent as it used to be when I was growing up in the 50s and even in the early 60s.
When you say it's not as prominent, what do you mean by that?
Because now, now there are other surnames probably just as popular or more popular. But when I went to school in Bodden town, they were Boddens, which is, as you said, that's how the town got its name, because it was predominantly, I understand, settled by Boddens, and they were the most numerous among the families. But now you have other names coming into the Cayman Islands, which are just as prominent or even more prominent. Boddens, Ebankses, Smiths, to an extent, people like McFields, all these were prominent Caymanian surnames, Seymours, but now we have other names with numbers just as numerous or more so than the original Caymanian settler names.
Mm-hmm. I see. Okay. The other question that I would have for you, Mr. Roy, is a lot of persons, and we had this discussion last week. We saw it being discussed on social media. Some persons have said that at some point you have indicated that we didn't have quote unquote bad slavery in the Cayman Islands. Now, what I just
No.
heard you say is we had domestic slavery, which is a very
Right.
different situation. So can you just clarify for us?
Okay, so here's what I say.
Yes.
I said that the Cayman Islands was not a slave society,
Mm-hmm.
but it was a society with slaves. And when I say it was not a slave society, I mean that there were not that many slaves that they outnumbered the free people.
Right.
In the Cayman Islands society, it was almost a balance of the same number of slaves as were the same number of free people.
Yes.
And the slavery that existed in the Cayman Islands was not plantation slavery. It was domestic slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we worked in the houses of the owners, the slave owners. And another distinction that the Cayman Islands had, different from many of the other Caribbean, especially the British Caribbean, was that slavery in the Cayman Islands was not an economic institution, because the white people or the near white people to which the Caymanian slaves were as poverty stricken as the slaves themselves. The only distinction the primary distinction between slave owners in the Cayman Islands and the slaves was that the slave owners were white or near white, but they weren't more economically empowered than the slaves. As a matter of fact, there were instances where the white people were so poor that when the slaves came to wash their laundry, the slaves had to bring the soap because the white people could not afford the soap. So it was in the Cayman Islands, it was a slavery based purely upon skin color. Because if you look around, Sandra, we don't have any great houses in Cayman as they were in Jamaica, in Barbados, in all these other islands where plantation slavery existed. And so it was not but slavery is slavery. And I don't want to romanticize it to say that it was a good slavery. The black slaves in Cayman had their problems. And what many people don't know that I can share with you, there was an anti-slavery movement in Cayman. There was an era of rebelliousness. Do you know where we call Fairbanks now?
Yes.
That was a slave and settlement called Runaway Ground. That was out of bounds to white people and out of bounds to those black people who collaborated with the whites. So there was Runaway Ground, which was almost like a maroon settlement where the black themselves controlled that. And adjacent to that was another place up by where Bobby Thompson Road is now, on that little gradient there, that was called Palmer's Heights. Palmer's Heights. Again, those were famous slave enclaves in Cayman.
Amazing. Wow. Okay, so I'm glad that we've clarified that, because of course I think last week we had an entire week talking about race relations in the Cayman Islands, and I said the exact same thing. Really, is that I could see where, based on the historical documents, and even as we look around our country, we've never had the capacity to do large scale farming. So one of the bigger things that slaves were used for would have been initially cotton, tobacco,
Right.
coffee, these things that were in demand. And Cayman just doesn't have the topography to even take that on. So
Well,
it was smaller farms, home individual farming, and domestic slaves, as you said. And of course, that
well,
does not take away from the institution of slavery and how persons would have been treated because of the color of their skin. And I
right.
also said, I think what it did present, and you rightfully said about this 50-50, because of course, when we came to emancipation in 1800s, we see that the count of slave to non-slaves was about 50-50, so right down the middle. Whereas in neighboring Jamaica, it was something like 10-1. So to
Yeah,
10 slaves, you had one free non-slave. So that's a humongous and significant difference. And I think that what it also did was, because you're in such closer proximity with the slaves mingling with their slave owners, you had this situation of a domestic relationship, whether it was forced or otherwise, being able to be created more so than if there was a traditional plantation environment.
exactly. And so that is one of the explanations of why we have white Boddens, black Boddens, and brown Boddens, because people have to understand slavery was a very violent institution,
Hmm.
and the masters didn't recognize the African unions. They didn't recognize the marriages of the Africans. And so any beautiful or attractive African woman or man, for that reason, was often taken by these white people for their own sexual satisfaction. And so out of that came this whole notion of people of different shades and hue, and bearing the names often of their masters, because often the slave masters didn't care. Here's another interesting fact that we have. While the relations between master and slave was was not strictly adversarial, because if you research into it, the masters and the slaves went turtling, and there was no revolt,
Hmm.
no rebellion. Slaves didn't take over the ship, cut the owner's throat, and threw them overboard. They came back to shore. So in the Cayman Islands, the only historical event we had of a near insurrection was one led by a woman called Long Celia. Now she got this name because she was over 6 feet tall. Long Celia in the 19th century tried to foment a slave uprising. And as a matter of fact, I've just completed a short story, which is based on her attempt to overthrow slavery in the Cayman Islands. She was betrayed by a friend whom she confided in, taken to the slave court in Georgetown, somewhere around the Hog's Thighs, and she was sentenced to receive 50 lashes on her bare body.
Wow.
Sandra, I can share with you that I am of the opinion that Long Celia is the only true national hero that the Cayman Islands has, in the sense that she was the only person in our history who tried to foment a rebellion to overthrow the system and bring fairness and equality to Black people. But you will understand, living in a racist society as we are, they will never declare Long Celia a national hero. But I can tell you the movement has support, because Sir Hilary Beckles, who is himself a very eminent professor of slave history, is one of the foremost people that suggests that Long Celia should be considered a national hero. And her attempt to overthrow the system is well recognized and respected throughout the Caribbean. But in the Cayman Islands, we don't know much about her, or I should say only a few people know much about her, because we don't teach our history in the schools.
Yes. Well,
So
gosh, that could be a whole other show. But
I'm telling you,
yeah,
and Nasaria Sakou wrote a good, Nasaria Sakou wrote a good poem about Long Celia, detailing the life and struggle of Long Celia.
wow. Well, I've never heard of her before, and I would certainly like to obtain some more information. And that's why I know that our guests, as well as myself, love having a guest on like you, because you have such a wealth of knowledge, historical information that otherwise would, you know, just be written, it wouldn't be written down anywhere, and it's going to eventually disappear if we, as you rightfully said, don't address how our history is even being recorded. So when we talk about racism in the Cayman Islands, I dedicated an entire week last week to this discussion in light of what we see being kicked off in Minneapolis in the U.S. and really what has spread worldwide. I mean, yesterday, quite shockingly enough, we saw a slave trader statue in was it Brixton?
Yeah,
Brixton?
Bristol,
Bristol,
Bristol.
right.
It
In
was
the
a famous
UK. Yes,
slave
actually
port.
being torn down and thrown into the river. And it had been a point of contention for a long time, but the officials never wanted to do anything about it. Finally, people are taking matters into their own hands. What do you say to people who say there is no racism in the Cayman Islands?
No, I say they're mistaken. They're viewing things through rose tinted glasses, because there is racism in the Cayman Islands. Racism existed, and it exists up until this time. Any society with slaves, or any slave society, was based upon racism. And so, although the Cayman Islands were not a slave society, as I have said, but rather a society with slaves, it is nevertheless a society in which racism is present. And anyone who read my works can tell that, because in my most recent work, I detail the story about racial nuances in my own family.
Mm-hmm.
In my own family, we
Mm-hmm.
had we had we had racial nuances, and
Yeah.
so that my family was not an exception. And I've encountered racism in the Cayman Islands. It may be subtle, or it is often, as we call it, sub rosa, under the table, but it is, and honest people will tell of their experiences, not being hired, being passed over promotion, purely on the basis of race. The whole system of education was skewed so that black people were maligned from being educated. The first, in the 19th century during slavery, let me relate this historical anecdote. The Michael Charity, which was a charity, Anglican-based charity, started by a lady called Lady Michael, who was wealthy and gave some money towards educating the children of slaves. But the charity opened two schools in Cayman, one in Bodden town, and a white Englishman by the name of John Malcolm came and he conducted the classes. So Malcolm conducted the classes, and they were mixed classes of white students and also black, the children of the slaves. The white people objected to their children being educated in the same classrooms, sitting side by side with black children. They objected, and they ordered Malcolm to desegregate, to segregate the school, to segregate the school. Malcolm refused, and as a result of that, the school, they petitioned Malcolm, he wouldn't yield, and as a result of that, Malcolm left after 1 year because he wouldn't give in to the prejudice of the white people. Now that was in the 19th century, and so the school closed. But here's what's interesting. Here's what's interesting, Sandra. After that, it was the black people, the slaves, who petitioned the Michael Charity and requested Malcolm to return because they realized that the only hope of their black children was to be educated. It wasn't the white who petitioned, it was the black people who petitioned. And the petition, copies of the petition are in archives with the names of the black people and the X's they put beside their names because they were illiterate and they couldn't write their names. But they made it known that they wanted education. So from that time until now, prejudice still exists. When I was growing up, there was a saying, if you're white, it's all right. If you're brown, stick around. And if you're black, stay in the back.
Right. Wow. Isn't that something? I've definitely heard that before. And you talk about the segregation of the white versus, the black community. Yesterday we were watching a video about Miss Leela McTaggart. I'm trying to remember her, Ross.
Sure.
Yes. And in that video, which her great granddaughter, Lisa Scott, and her husband, Mr. Danny Scott, put together, we heard Mr. Steve McField mention the segregation. So that when he started going to the library facilities, it was kind of unusual for her to be one of those persons that welcomed children of all colors
Right.
to the library and encourage them to read and to have access to books that were there.
Yeah, yes, because like I say, it was not considered the thing for black people to aspire to education. And I can tell you, in my own case, there was little scope after you left all age school in the government system. There was little scope for children of color or people of color to go to further their education. And in my case, that is why I have such a great respect for a man called Mr. Clifton. We call him affectionately C.A. Hunter. He recognized that the way Cayman Islands society was developing, that there were many children of color who would not have been able to afford an education, but they were quite capable of receiving an education because they couldn't go to the schools which existed, which were church schools, and we catered predominantly to the people, the white people, and the people who were wealthy. And I went to a school, a secondary school, with many other people, many other prominent people in this society, called the Jamaica Local Center. And from that school, we went to train as teachers, women and men. My cousin Lillian, Lucille Seymour, my friend Gilbert McLean, a whole cadre of us who were people of color, but there were some what I call near white people as well, who were restricted because of they were economically not able to go, but yet they had the intelligence and the brain capacity. So that there was, and then later teacher McField came, and he was an advocate for black people to get educated and for the black children. And the secondary modern school was started. And then again, that was a school predominantly for the children of color and for the poor near white students, while the other children went to the high school, which was then run under the auspices of the Presbyterian, now United Church.
Right.
So we have a history. The problem with us in the Cayman Islands, Sandra, is that we have a penchant for denying our history. And that is why certain things happen to us that shouldn't happen. Because instead of us facing the facts and trying to exorcise the old ghosts, we bury our heads in the sand like the ostrich and pretend that it doesn't exist or it didn't exist.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, this denial continues to this day. Why do you think we are in such a state of denial? What is it about us that we would not even, a great number of us admit that we have had slavery, that has had a lasting impact on the equalities that are afforded to people, even now in 2020? Why do you think we live in such a state of denial? Is it because we've had too much of a comfortable lifestyle where we've never been agitated enough to actually fight for anything?
It's because we aren't taught in the schools. We aren't taught our history in the schools. And so we grow up ignorant of who we are. I mean, I when I was at the University College, I was fascinated by these young black males who wanted to dress like the American ghetto. And I implemented a strict regime. You can't wear your pants on your buttocks, because Caribbean people, we're Caribbean people, and that's not how we portray ourselves. That's not how we behave. That's not a behavior pattern. So these young people, they knew no different. They didn't understand the significance of certain things. They didn't even know that came from the California prison system. And it's the way the homosexual advertise themselves. And so they thought because it was hip, the in thing to do, that they did it. And I said, no. So a lot of our behavior is as a result of ignorance. A lot of our attitude is as a result of ignorance. And that ignorance comes from the fact that we don't know who we are. We don't know from whence we came. We don't know the struggles that our parents and our ancestors been through, because we believe that we were all. And here's another common fallacy that really irks me. If you ask a Caymanian who they are, they will tell you every nationality in the world. They will claim, they will never admit that they have any black pigmentation in them.
Right. Yes, I've heard that with my own ears. I always find it so interesting. Sometimes people from East End, West Bay, all over. The first thing is, oh well, I have Scottish ancestry.
Exactly.
Look at you going, you're a black person. What are you talking about?
Scottish, Irish, and English and all that. And but let me say this, to an extent, it is true, because we like I say, we're mixed.
Yes.
But to name out everyone except the African, the black, that's the first one I call. That's the first one I call.
Yes, clean that first.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
the first one I called because the others are really, to me, irrelevant. And a lot of people don't like me because I emphasize my blackness, a trait and an education I got from my dear departed mother, whom I absolutely adore because I knew about Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association and the African National Anthem before I left home because she taught us that. She taught her children that, especially the older ones. And I knew about the struggle, and she told us beyond a doubt that we were black.
Mhm,
But
mhm.
she added a proviso. But because you are black, it doesn't mean that you are inferior to anyone.
Right. Wow. Well, I know that unfortunately we have very few homes where that message is being conveyed in this day and age. We seem to have people who are aspiring to certain economic levels, if you will. And with that comes the price of having to keep your mouth shut. So
Exactly.
if you want certain management jobs and organizations, you have to keep your mouth shut. You can't be seen as an agitator. You can't be seen as someone who is willing to speak the truth on race relations, unemployment of largely the Caymanians in this community, lack of educational opportunities, all of these things. Once you have attained this, what we like to think of level of success, you have to pay that back by playing the game and keeping your mouth shut. And that's a problem because those persons who gain the economic freedom are perhaps in more of a position than anyone else to truly make a difference. But they are the ones with the mental chains, around their hands, ankles, mouths, everything, and unable to speak up. We were talking yesterday a little bit about the fracturing of the educational system here in the Cayman Islands, where we have predominantly expatriate white private schools. And in those institutions, when you have, Caymanian children of all shades and color, once they go into those institutions, they are treated differently by the teachers, by the other students, and even I dare say by the parents. And a parent conveyed a story to me recently about how, when her child was at that institution, one of those institutions, I should say, there's more than one on island, obviously, having had a teacher make a remark about a stack of papers and said, I need you guys to neatly put this stack of papers together, not like a Caymanian stack of papers, which is obviously very insulting. And I think, how do we, we have racism amongst our own people. So we have family members who, see each other as less than because you might be 2 shades darker than them. But we also have an issue, Mr. Roy, where we are importing racist individuals into our community. And we are allowing them to own businesses, we're allowing them to be our educators, to have access to our children for a large part of the day. How do you think we need to start to address some of these concerns?
Well, the most effective way of addressing those those kinds of situations is first of all by knowing who we are and
Yes.
by establishing what kind of society the Cayman Islands is, or what kind of society we wish the Cayman Islands to be. And
Hmm.
I agree with you. Part of the problem is the fact that we have teachers who are coming from what I would call the metropolitan countries who are themselves racist. Now, I can tell you years ago, when I was going to school, the education system was much different
Hmm.
because we had teachers, when we looked, if they were not Caymanian, they looked like us. They were either
Right.
from Jamaica, they were from Trinidad, or they were from Barbados. So they looked like
Hmm.
us. They could empathize with us. We were not intimidated. You
Right.
know, this is
They were
not the
being
case now. And so what happens, and it's even worse now than it was then, because the disparities now between the haves and the have-nots are so obvious that the students who come from the less privileged homes and areas feel a consciousness and feel that there's a specialist singled out. by these teachers who are insensitive. And I've heard of cases where they mock the way we speak, in addition to mocking our dress and our taste in other areas, they mock the way we speak. Whereas that kind of thing never existed before. And so what we have happening now in many cases is a demoralization of the students and a put down of them because they're made to look their difference in appearance, in skin color, and in manner of speech is made to be inferior and not of acceptable standards. And so we have a big problem. The students can't learn if they think they do not have the respect of their teachers and if they're not accepted as people of ability.
Yes. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in. I want to read some comments, Mr. Roy, while you're still here. I was hoping to have you here for the entire program, but you've learned that he has a previous commitment at 8 o'clock. So we will extend an open invitation. There were some persons who had messaged saying that they wanted to get into your book that you've written because it helped them understand a lot about Cayman culture. When they moved to the Cayman Islands, they've read some of your books over the years and they found them to be extremely helpful and useful. So we'll have to spend a day maybe going through some of that information. I know your last book was more about the political landscape of the Cayman Islands, which of course impacts.
But it also to an extent tells of my personal story, how coming from an underprivileged and a dysfunctional, because my father, bless his soul, was an alcoholic, and my mother went through terrible physical and emotional abuse.
Right.
And I wrote the book because I wanted to inspire other young Caymanians, especially Caymanian males who seem to get lost in these kinds of environments, how it's possible to raise yourself up and come out of those kinds of circumstances and come out of it successful. So although it's a political story, it's as much a personal story of how I overcame these struggles and how there was such a close bond between my mother and I, and how she nurtured me, and how in return we had a covenant, what I call the Abrahamic covenant, that she would help me in return for my helping her and my siblings. And so it's a story that I think that is worth reading. I hope that it could have inspired young men, because I endured all kinds of things, bullying, put downs, all kinds of stuff, because my father, when he was drunk, was not a nice man.
Wow. Nellie says, good morning, Sandra. Also, give a special good morning to Mr. Bodden. He's a special person. Jevi says he's enjoying the panel this morning and good to see Mr. Roy. Lillian says good morning to all, that she's a Bodden, but from her dad, and he was born in Honduras. How do you explain these Boddens? So do you know anything about the connection between the Boddens in Cayman and the Boddens in Honduras?
Well, I share those connections. Let me tell you what happened in the early days, probably from the 17th century, certainly down to the 18th century. Many Caymanians left the Cayman Islands and settled in the Bay Islands of Honduras, Guanaja, Utila, and Rotan. And every Caymanian surname you would find there: Boddens, Rivers, Ebanks, Colonels, every one. As a matter of fact, at one time, there were as many Caymanians in these Bay Islands as there were in the Cayman Islands themselves. And the settlement that Cayman Brac was only permanently settled when these people returned from the Bay Islands of Honduras and the Cayman Brac. The people who came from Cayman Brac originally went back to Cayman Brac and they settled. Then that was when Cayman Brac was settled permanently. You have to understand that Caymanians were, like many people who come here now, economic migrants. There was nothing in the Cayman Islands. And so Caymanians went seeking a better life, an economic livelihood. and they went to the Bay. You know what happened? There were so many of them at the Bay, in the Bay Islands, that the Bay Islands were declared a crown colony of the United Kingdom. It was the Americans in the 19th century who got on the mainland Honduras government and said, look, we don't want these people here. You have to expel them. Britain is claiming these islands. So that is when the movement was made to settle, to repatriate Caymanians, and the Honduran, the mainland Honduran government put pressure on the British, and the Caymanians had to come back to the Cayman Islands. Not before, however, they had established families, and that they left there, and all the surnames and all the Caymanian kinds of cultural things of cultural importance was left. It was similar in Cuba, in Isle of Pines, now Isla de Juventud, where my mother was born and went to school during her formative years. There was a similar situation of Caymanians going there to seek work in the orange groves and on the plantations and in the homes of the rich white grandees in Cuba, in Havana. I have relatives who studied at a famous hotel, and one of my relatives, now deceased, is a certified chef as a result of that. And I have other relatives in Cuba. Some of them are still in Cuba. Some of them joined the armed forces, and so they didn't wish to come out. But that's the history of Cayman. And so that's how we have these Boddens in Honduras, bushes, e-banks, rivers, McFields, all those people.
Right. Wow. I know that we have some relatives in Cuba, for example, that we're aware of. I'm not so sure about Honduras, but very possible as well.
Yeah.
So that is interesting. And I had mentioned last week during Hurricane Mitch. People corrected me. At first, I was thinking it was Michelle, but it was Hurricane Mitch, which devastated Honduras, in particular the Bay Islands. I remember watching, and this wasn't long after I returned to the Cayman Islands, and I was sitting there watching the local news, and I saw them doing an interview with people in the Bay Islands. And for the first time ever, I heard people who sounded just like us in terms of that very unique Caymanian accent that you don't hear anywhere else in the world. And I was shocked and taken aback. And I'm sitting here thinking, how do people in Honduras sound
Yeah,
like Caymanians? But it turns out they're Caymanians. That connection is there.
exactly. And it's the same. It was the same way in Isle of Pines, now Isla de Juventud. All these people, all the e-banks, all of these people who sell a river, particularly from West Bay, you know. Yeah, particularly, but not exclusively. Yes. So that's
Wow.
it. We have a very interesting and colorful history, and it's a pity that it's not taught in the schools, because were it taught in schools, our young people would have greater self-esteem. They
Mhm,
would have a greater sense of pride,
mhm.
and they would be proud in who they are and where they came from, because our ancestors were great people. They were proficient. They were people of the frontier, and anyone who settles, as the Cayman Islands were a frontier society. Anyone who grew up on the frontier, you have to be industrious, you have to be frugal, you have to be hardy. And I will say something, Sandra. The history of women in early Cayman is a fascinating history, because many of the women were wealthy widows. Some of them married. And there's a case in Bodden town of an American Yankee called Nat Glover, who came from he was a slave owning Yankee who came from Boston in the 19th century, and he married a prominent Bodden town woman of wealth. There were several women of wealth in the Cayman Islands who married to expatriates, and the wealth these women had were able to propel their expatriates' husbands into places of prominence in the Cayman Islands. So women in early Caymanian society did very well. They did very well. Sarah Lamar. There was a woman called Sarah Truster who not only was wealthy, but she bought slaves out of slavery and gave them their freedom in Caymanian society.
Wow, it's amazing. Just a few more comments, Mr. Roy, before we let you go. Even Odd says the long Celia story is correct. I did a social studies lesson with year 4 students and they enjoyed it. Karen says she's enjoying it. Awesome information. Jessica Kazali says, good morning, Mr. Roy. Wonderful to hear you this morning. Lillian says, McLean says that Cayman has always taken up other cultures, other countries' cultures. And so I was under the impression that we have no culture. Interesting. Sean says, love listening to the Honorable Roy Bodden, a great Caymanian educator. And then Jessica confirms that there was a migration to Honduras and other neighboring islands from Caymanian families at some point when turtle supply was low in the Caymans and they had to go look for food in other parts of the Caribbean. And I wanted to again thank Albert Lindsay for sharing a document with us last week that had quite a bit of historical information. It was a report that was provided to the United Kingdom back in the 1800s on the Cayman Islands and listed a lot of the names of the local families, how many were free, how many were slaves, and just a general overall summary of what the islands were about. And I found it interesting to see that we were actually, Caymanians back then, were actually exporting the little that we had in exchange for some supply
Yes,
from neighboring countries like Jamaica. So a lot
exactly.
of Caymanians have been taught that we were reliant on Jamaica and Jamaica was somehow giving us a handout or taking care of
No, no,
we need to have that
no,
we need to have that conversation specifically as well.
no,
Like
no. Yeah, because
created um, belief.
no, I never miss an opportunity to correct that. I'm telling you, as Caymanians, we can be proud because in all of the British Caribbean, we have never been grant aided. Britain has never had to pay our way, but they had to pay the way. They had to. Jamaica and all these other territories were grant aided, much bigger populations, much more settled industries and advanced agriculture. The Cayman Islands were never, up to this day, we were never grant aided, always an industrious people. And see, these are the things that we're missing out because these are the things that should be taught in history in our schools. And the history, Sandra,
Yes.
should not be written by outsiders. It should be written by
Exactly.
Caymanians. There are people here who are quite capable. And now, when things open up, I would recommend the archives. I used to live in the archives, and
Yes.
those ladies there are most helpful. They're most accommodating, and all of this information is there. I'm not making this up. I'm not speaking off the top of my head, and I can speak of Dr. Steve McField too, and the archivist. It's amazing how much information is there. All this stuff about the settlements in Honduras and
Mhm.
Cuba and all that stuff it's right there.
Wow.
It's right there.
I mean, yeah, because I'm always shocked at when I hear conversations and Jamaicans who, 20s and 30s, so they don't even know anything about their own history, much less our history, will sit down and say, "Well, Jamaicans built the Cayman Islands. You
No,
guys
no.
heard of us? We made
Are
it."
you kidding?
and,
No,
and we
they
accept
dare.
that
Look,
narrative. We accept that
that
narrative because, again, somehow it's being said to make us feel less than, our other Caribbean counterparts,
listen.
less than.
I understand. They cannot use that to claim ownership of these
Yes.
Cayman Islands because there is not one thing that we got from them for which we didn't pay. Not one thing we got from them for which we didn't pay. It
Yeah.
is true that we relied on them for teachers, for doctors, and for all these professional people, but we paid. They didn't have to give us anything. And when we were building the airport, we used their equipment, but we paid for it. And we used some of their engineers. We paid for the Cayman Islands have never been a people who were paupers, who didn't pay for the services they got, whether it was from Jamaica, whether it's from the United Kingdom, whether it's from anywhere else.
Wow. Well, we need to dig a little bit deeper. Lewis says all the grandfathers and most grandmothers were Caymanian in Guanaja. So Sherry Ann says that we do have family because Sherry Ann and I are related. We do have family in Cuba. And she just sent a picture of me of one of those such persons that are in Cuba. Alma says my great grandparents were Boddens from East End, but my grandfather was born in Honduras. Also, there were seamen coming having children in diverse places. So yes, Caymanian seamen were out there sowing their oats. And John Smith says, don't forget the island of San Andres and Old Providence. Many Caymanians went
That's
there
right.
as well. And there are generations there, such as the Smiths, the Ebankses, Connolly, Bodden, and many more. Now,
Well,
we know you've got to go. We're already running into your time a little bit here, so we don't want to keep you any longer than we have to. But
I just wanted to say, Sandra,
yes.
you know what made us famous? Because we were cut off.
Hmm.
Caymanian people built their own schooners, their own ships, built them, and we sailed around the Caribbean. Caymanians sailed in Cartagena, Colombia. We went to San Andres. We went to Providenciales. We went to Nicaragua, Corn Island. We went to all these places. I call them, we were the Argonauts of the Caribbean. So in all these places we had settlements. I want to say that because I used to listen to the old men who gathered on our porch on guard house, and that's where I wrote a lot of stories of listening, sometimes eavesdropping on their conversations. And I want to say this, that in all of the places Caymanians went, they maintained a respectability, and they never watered down their culture, and they were not reticent, or they were not intimidated, or they were not ashamed to say that they were Caymanians. And they gained the respect of all the persons who were their neighbors in these jurisdictions: Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Colombia,
Hmm. Hmm.
Panama. Yeah,
Yes. Wow.
went to Jamaica too. Many of them went to Jamaica too because we had a great relationship with Jamaica. Cayman. There were no immigration controls. You got off the plane in Jamaica, you got off the boat, and you could work there. So it was, but nobody gave us anything for free. Nor did they own us. They didn't. They didn't.
That's wonderful to know. So Sue Arch Parson says, "Good morning, everyone. Sandra, please think about having Mr. Roy on for a week. His books are fascinating, but when he speaks, he brings our history to life." So I think you've been a hit in terms of guests that we've had on this program. So we want to invite you. I mean, you can come on at any time. It's just a matter
Well,
of
it's just I'm sorry that I have this prior engagement.
yes.
But I enjoy your show. I enjoy talking. So I'll come again anytime you invite me. As I say, I'm humble. I'll come
Yes.
again anytime you invite me.
And we've been sort of, I think, mentally planning a show with you from when you released your book last year. Was it sometime last year that that book was released,
Yeah,
latest novel?
that's it.
And it kind of just never happened. And here we are now that we have additional shows on because of COVID-19. The opportunity has been created. So we will definitely do this again. I think people have so many questions and they want to learn so much more. And I think this is wonderful that we have Caymanians, young, middle age, older, who are tuned into this program, almost 100 people who want to hear more about what you've got to say. They want to hear more about Caymanian history. We've had Christine Goldburn, who has just jumped into the conversation. I'm always keen to learn because the more I learn, the more I realize that I have so much more to learn because the learning process just never, never ends.
Right.
Yeah, and there's so many things that we can focus on from education to politics. So we would like to again thank you for joining the program this morning. Everyone, please give a big shout out and a big thank you and just a vote of gratitude for Mr. Roy Bodden, who's joined us this morning on the Cold Hard Truth. We will continue to have these conversations. So now that we've got a little bit of free time, we'll go into a few other things. But Mr. Roy, thank you again for agreeing to join us. And we'll speak about firming up some more time for you to come in and we can discuss some of these other issues.
Sure, thank you. I'm humbled to have been invited. Thank you kindly.
All right, folks. So again, that was Mr. Roy Bodden joining us here on Cayman Roads, a cold hard truth, and he sure was giving it to us cold and hard. So we want to continue the conversation this morning. Now that we have a little open mic opportunity, there's a few things that we can update you guys on and talk about. Tomorrow's show, I don't want you guys to miss this because tomorrow's show is going to be equally as interesting. We have scheduled to come in Kathy Frazier and Mr. Oliver Watler. Now, Kathy and Oliver have done a wonderful job of putting together a lot of genealogical information. Both of them have started their own like mapping of their family trees, and they have done significant research. And a number of years ago, I went to one of these discussions at the National, I think it was put on by the National Trust in conjunction with the Archives Department. But both of them spoke on a panel, and it was some of the most amazing information that I have ever heard in terms of, once again, who we are and the history of the Cayman Islands. So I think that it's just absolutely amazing what they've been able to discover. And some of the information, I'll leave it till tomorrow because you guys just have got to tune in. Some of the information I think will blow your socks off and how they've come about learning, how we're connected and who we are. So definitely please tune in for tomorrow's show. Carol says, thank you and unbelievable. It's not taught in schools. Why? Um, Carol, Mr. Roy kind of touched on that briefly. And I think part of the reason uh, we need to ask our politicians why. But, when we have individuals who are administrators who are running the show, so in other words, chief officers and school principals and school administrators who are not necessarily Caymanians, and by and large, a lot of the teachers, they don't seem and this is just my opinion. I want to be very clear. I have no personal experience with the school system since I left in the fourth grade back in the 80s. Um, well, I mean, you could count law school, but that's obviously different as an adult. So I can't speak to the government school. My memories are not very full of what happened when I was 8 years old. But I personally think that it's a combination of things. And one of the things is that you have people in the school system and administrators in the education system in general who are teaching these subjects who they themselves have no interest in Cayman history. I don't know if that's just because they don't think it's interesting or whatever. But the curriculum does not include a whole lot about Caymanian history. We have it very watered down. So the only thing they want us to know is we have a national bird. Um, what else might they be teaching schools? I mean, I don't even know. So I think it's very watered down. There's no real historical information there. Knowledge is power, Carol, and I think that it should be taught in schools. Like Mr. Roy said, it gives our young people a sense of pride and knowing who they are and where they have come from. And we have a very rich culture. But included in that richness, we have to be honest about things like our slave background or slave history. And, I think that those are the things that we struggle with. And at some level, the best way to control people and again, I think we are some of the most enslaved persons in the world. And I do mean mentally enslaved. The best way to control people is to keep them ill informed, uninformed, and uneducated, especially about who they are as a people, because that gives you strength. And just knowing that, just like Mr. Roy said, if someone comes up to you and they make this argument that, oh, well, we built the Cayman Islands, you can say, hold on a second, actually, no, you didn't. And here's the proof for me to substantiate that. You know, we were exporting goods to Jamaica that we had. It wasn't a whole lot, but it was turtle meat and whatever few things that we had in order to get provisions and supplies. So how was that a situation where you took care of us? So I think knowledge is power, and having accurate information empowers you to be a stronger, more confident person, so that you can walk through this world not believing that you're better than anybody else, but that you are equal to anyone else. And so no one else can put you down. No one else can put themselves on a pedestal. And as a result, you know, push their own agendas, whether that's hiring more of their imported friends or family members or whatever. So I think there are a number of reasons why it has happened historically, Carol. And of course, our political arm, our ministers of education, don't seem to have the desire to really push for proper curriculum in our schools when it comes to who you are, what is our history. You know, this is part of who we are as a people, and it's so incredibly diverse. So, Gadiel, good morning. Benista, thank you for tuning in. George Fullerton has been enjoying the program. George, thank you. He says that he's still learning. And George has really been enjoying the shows. He's been messaging me over the last couple of days saying how much he has learned from even last week. And he has found the last couple shows extremely enjoyable. Ingrid says good morning to Mr. Bodden. Hopefully, he will go back and watch the show and garner some of your comments. John Smith says because we need more Caymanian teachers, and I think that that is a large part of it as well, because Caymanian teachers, you would hope, would have an interest in in teaching our history. Sorry. Um, right. So yes, I mean, I think that that's important, and there's so many reasons why Caymanians do not stay in the educational system. Even when we get the really good ones, we seem to somehow end up forcing them out of the system. Benice McLaughlin said, Mr. Watler will bring it. And Sharon, thank you so much for tuning in. Yes, I mean, like I said, the session that I attended was extremely informational. Both him and Miss Kathy Frazier have a wealth of information. So I do hope that you guys will tune in to tomorrow's program. So, by way of updates, we do have a few things that are going on around the world and in our communities. One of the most interesting things that is happening as we speak is there was a um, fire overnight, apparently in neighboring Jamaica at the very famous Coronation Market. Now, I saw some details trickling in. I'm waiting for our regional correspondent to, I'm not sure if she's still snoozing or what's going on, but I'm waiting for her to update us on precisely what is going on with that situation. Um, she might be working on getting that up on the website, hopefully. So it looks like quite a blaze based on what I saw. Um, yeah, this is not a good sign at all. It has something to do with. I'm trying to see what Jerry Ann says. That's not Coronation Market. Curry has a larger overhead structure. Looks like Ray Ray. Um, okay, so we will get information, but we do know the fire was actually at Coronation Market. So the photos that have come in have been said to be from that location. So we'll get some confirmation on that, folks. But yes, I think it's incredibly interesting that this fire has occurred overnight. It seems to have been related possibly to some situation with the police and a gunman. I don't know if it was a shootout or the gunman set the market ablaze. I don't really know what happened, but we will shortly have those details for you. So, of course, here at Cayman Mall Road, we appreciate that we are not living in a world by ourselves. It is called Cayman Mall Road, so still 95% of what we cover in terms of content remains Caymanian content. But there are things that happen elsewhere in the world that impact us, whether that be in Jamaica or elsewhere. Um, okay, so yes, thank you very much, Jerry Ann and Charmaine. Police have actually confirmed that it's Ray Ray Market and not Coronation Market, as earlier reported, that was set ablaze as thugs engaged the police in a shootout in downtown Kingston. So we will correct that. Um, information now. Yes, so thank you guys for that. Okay, so I think the initial news coming out of Jamaica was that it was Coronation Market, and we now understand that. Um, I don't know where Ray Ray Market is. I guess we'll find out from a regional reporter. So, yes, folks, I was saying that we brought a regional reporter on. Um, okay, yes. All right, so we just want to correct this. So I'm just quickly making a quick correction there. So yes, all right, folks. Well, there we do. We got a live update there for you. Um, we will find out more about what's happening there. Hopefully, no one was injured in that situation. Um, hmm, quite quite amazing. So, in other news, Susan, thank you so much. She said I would encourage anyone Cayman or non-Caymanian to purchase the Cayman History book from the National Archives. He has founded it upon the seas, and any of Mr. Roy Bodden's books, especially his latest book. Thank you for that encouragement, Susan. Um, I think we certainly do need to make sure we're well informed and that we are teaching and informing our children. What about private schools, folks? Some of you have children that go to private schools. Do they do a better job of teaching Caymanian history, if at all? I would be very curious to know that information. Um, I see a few of you sending me some messages. So yesterday we discussed a young lady who is involved in what is an alleged baby scammer situation, where she's going around soliciting, at least goods, if not, I don't know if money's also been involved from persons claiming that she is either having a baby or she's adopting a baby or she's helping out a mother. I mean, her story has changed several times since this became public late on Sunday. So the police have confirmed by way of a press statement that they are investigating this matter. And they're also warning people to, especially during these times, to be very vigilant and cautious about who you decide to assist and who you give donations to, because unfortunately, there are persons out there who are willing to take advantage of you and advantage of the COVID 19 situation, and that they are just really kind hearted people out there who are willing to give. So I think most of us are glad to hear that because, I think persons who engage in this sort of conduct or behavior certainly need to be dealt with in terms of the law. In other good news, New Zealand has announced that they are removing, for the most part, all of their COVID 19 restrictions in light of the fact that they have not had a positive COVID 19 test result in some 17 days. So, this is a humongous milestone for New Zealand. Now, I want to be very, very clear about what we're talking about here. So, they're talking about elimination of the COVID 19 disease or the coronavirus as opposed to complete eradication. They actually are two very, very different things. Nonetheless, they are in a position where basically people can get back to work, people can get back to their lives as normal, and there will not be any social distancing or anything in place. The one thing that they will not be doing is they will not be reopening their borders anytime soon. And last month, the prime minister of New Zealand said that that will be very much down the line. So we don't know how far down the line that will be. But I think most people appreciate that even as individual countries seek to secure their borders from COVID 19 and make some strides and some headway in this regard, they can't then, after having done all of this work, turn around and reopen their borders prematurely because they will simply be inviting people in to the jurisdiction who undoubtedly will have, been positive for coronavirus. So Jamaica, it is estimated, will have some 10,000 persons return back home during this time. And sorry. Um, right. So Jamaica's expecting some 10,000. Sorry. Yes. Okay. So Jamaica is expecting some 10,000 returning residents during the next, I guess, couple weeks re-entering Jamaica. And of course, most of those persons will not be subject to a mandatory quarantine. I think they're going to be encouraging people to try to quarantine at home. But of course, with 10,000 persons coming in, naturally, some of those would be coronavirus or COVID 19 positive. So we'll keep an eye on that situation and certainly provide you with updates if and when they are available. And the other thing is Jamaica is actually opening itself back on the 15th of the month, which I believe is next week, to tourists, to everybody. So at this point, nationals are able to return, but as of the 15th, the borders will be completely open to tourists. So they have caved in to the economic pressures of people saying we need to reopen our businesses, we need to reopen, and then because the money is the most important consideration. We've seen other countries that have reopened prematurely and what the end result has been, including China, South Korea, and a few others. And it doesn't usually work in their favor because then they end up getting second and third waves of the coronavirus, and they either have to shut down again or the death toll and the number of positive cases increases significantly. Susan says Cayman Academy teaches Cayman history starting from year 1 to year 6. I'm not sure about the high school. Thank you for that information. Carol says Guernsey is the same, now COVID free. The World Health Organization claims asymptomatic people do not spread the virus. So, how on earth is it spreading here? Now, Carol, I do want to talk about this because I saw someone sent me that report. And I did see, let me just think about who sent that to me. I'm going to have a quick look at it. I haven't had a chance to see where the World Health Organization is actually getting their information from. And it does say May. So, I mean, you know, this isn't really a definitive thing, but it says asymptomatic spread of coronavirus is very rare, was the one thing that they said. And again, I'm curious to know where they're getting this information from. This article, according to CNBC, says that corona patients without symptoms aren't driving the spread of the virus, casting doubt and concerns by some researchers that the disease could be difficult to contain due to asymptomatic infections. And Carol is absolutely right. The vast majority of our infections here in the Cayman Islands have indeed been asymptomatic. And so it says some people, particularly young and otherwise healthy individuals who are infected by the coronavirus, never develop symptoms or only develop mild symptoms, and others might not develop symptoms until days after they were actually infected. Preliminary evidence, so it's not conclusive, as we say in the world of digital media, speculation and not confirmation. So, preliminary evidence says from the earliest outbreaks indicate that the virus could spread from person to person contact, even if the carrier didn't have symptoms. But WHO, the World Health Organization officials, now say that while asymptomatic spread can occur, it is not the main way that it is transmitted. Well, of course it wouldn't be. The main way would be if people have symptoms. So some of these headlines, like you got to really dig a little bit deeper into the stories to see exactly what they're saying So saying that it's not the main way, it seems like common sense to me. And even, Dr. Lee has said that here, that because you wouldn't be shedding as much because you're not sneezing and whatever else that comes with when you're actually sick, that would make completely logical sense. And I don't know that this is really anything incredibly shocking or new if you've really been paying attention. But they go on to say, from the data we have, it still seems to be rare that an asymptomatic person actually transmit onward to a secondary individual. So government responses should focus on detecting and isolating infected persons with symptoms and tracking anyone who might have come into contact with them. She acknowledged that some studies have indicated asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic spread in nursing homes and in household settings. So listen, we've talked about what pre-symptomatic is. So that's before you would have full-blown symptoms. And there is strong research that says even in the pre-symptomatic stage, you definitely are spreading it. So they're acknowledging that those studies are there. And it says that more research and data are needed to truly answer the question of whether the coronavirus can spread widely through asymptomatic carriers. So listen, this is one of those stories where the devil is in the details. So in other words, there's nothing conclusive yet. I don't know why the World Health Organization would have even issued a statement or said anything, in my opinion, to simply confuse people even more. But the bottom line is they don't know. They are speculating that it doesn't transmit it as much as um, primary persons, and they don't quite know what percentage. I mean, none of this, like I said, is really new in my mind, and it makes quite logical sense, in fact, that that would be the case. So this is where you want to read a little bit more into what is being said, because I know a lot of persons have been posting these stories claiming that, well, then this means that the government should reopen because they don't have a case, especially with children, for why children who largely remain asymptomatic, why children should continue to be protected in the way that we have been overly protecting them, according to some parents. And there has been a petition that has been started to lobby the government to just open up summer camps and a free for all and let kids go out there. And I find that so incredibly interesting that people are willing to put their most vulnerable at risk. And I think because, again, the Cayman Islands has been relatively protected from coronavirus, yes, we have over 100 infections for sure, but we only have the one imported death. We haven't had any children that have died. So we don't have families that have experienced those losses. Whereas, for example, in Jamaica, they've had a child die. I think until we have some of those experiences, we are once again, because we tend to be people who live in a bubble and who are overly optimistic, we are making this argument. There's many living here that are making this argument that this isn't as bad as it seems. And let's go ahead and lift the restrictions because Cayman is mostly asymptomatic. It's not a big deal. So I think that there will be people who will want to jump on this latest information, which in my mind, again, isn't anything particularly new, but the World Health Organization has made a statement that it's rare. And they're using, it says, if asymptomatic spread proves to not be a main driver of coronavirus, the policy implications could be tremendous. But this hasn't been proven yet. So, I think we just need to continue to read on this and see where we're at. Like I said, there have been a number of, like the former K-Moms group. I see people commenting in those groups that, oh, this is evidence that supports the fact that we should open up our borders and just, let's get the kids back to doing whatever it is that they do. So I'm not particularly convinced. I think we need to be very, very cautious. And, I think you need to protect your children. The thing with children, and I agree with the premier when he says this, it's so incredibly difficult to control children and what they do. And I've got I mean, hello, based on what happened with the reopening of restaurants this weekend, it's even difficult to control adults who we expect to be responsible. But I, for one, have a 3 year old, and sometimes, she gets into a mess and germy situations. And I will say to her, let's go wash your hands right now. Don't touch your face. Da, da, da. And I mean, she gets to the sink, poor little child with the best of intentions, about to wash her hands. And what does she do? She rubs her eyes or touches her face. I'm just like, oh my God, I just told you don't touch your face. So it is near impossible when children get sick. And we've all had children in daycare and that sort of situation, um, who, the second they go into an environment like that, um, they start to get sick and they pick up, the cold and the flu and whatever right away. And part of the reason is it's impossible to super disinfect everything around children, no matter how much you try, how much you clean. That is why when they have outbreaks of what is this thing that they get, the skin, hand and foot disease, hand, mouth, and foot disease. One child gets it, it quickly spreads because it's so highly contagious. Things like the chicken pox and all these other things are easily spread amongst children because they touch everything. They touch themselves. You can't keep them from socializing with each other and touching each other when they're in, close proximity. So I find it amusing when parents say, well, we can create social distancing with kids, and still have summer camps and create bubbles or whatever. And I'm like, how do you do that? Have you ever tried to create any kind of distancing with a toddler? It is built into their DNA to want to touch people and touch things at that age because they're going through that sensory phase where they are learning. So we even had, now that we can do a little bit more with people outside of other households, we saw a friend yesterday and we were maintaining social distancing between our daughter and their toddler. And our daughter was crying, and I want to go inside and play with her, and I want to have a play date, because you can't explain to a 6 year old that we're keeping you 6 feet away from her and trying to have this long distance conversation for a reason. And we were saying to her, no, 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 we can't go inside of her house yet. And she's like, why? Because the police said so. Well, why? It's like the constant why. And at some point, the why is you just can't even answer anymore. Why are the police saying that? Well, okay, because people are sick. Why? Why are they sick? It's just like, so it's almost easier to just continue with complete isolation, because you don't have the tears and the fighting and whatever else that will ensue if you try to put them in somewhat close proximity, but still maintaining social distancing. It just doesn't really work very well. And listen, I get that parents, listen, I totally understand this. And I get that parents have probably had enough of their own children. And we all appreciate now, our, child care workers a bit more. Maybe some of them will get a pay raise after, um, after COVID-19, because we appreciate how much they're actually investing and putting into your children, and how much time and energy it takes to work with, especially, I wouldn't say especially, but work with younger children, but probably teenagers are just as bad. So I think a lot of parents are doing it for more selfish reasons, like they need the break. It's not even about the children having to socialize, or whatever. They're just like, listen, I'm fed up with these children. I need a break. I need to be able to sit down with my girlfriends and have a glass of wine and let the children go off and run and play with their friends. And if they get coronavirus, who cares? That's how some parents are now seeing the situation. So I think it's more of a desperate thing. Um, Ramsey Seymour says, I went to Truth for Youth, sorry, in the 80s, and until the early 90s, I had never learned anything about slavery was here in the Cayman Islands, or anything about Black Caymanians. Wow, that's rather shocking information, but thank you for that, Ramsey. Um, I guess I shouldn't be surprised. And again, we think about who's running the schools, where they're from. I think Truth for Youth was started up by some, missionary people or something, Christian missionaries or whatever. And, you know, a lot of things are done in the name of Christianity. And even the teachings, you know, they kind of whitewash and water down a lot of things. So, not particularly surprised by that. Their biggest agenda is to be teaching you um, to submit to what they tell you that is in the Bible. So Sue says, "Morning, Sandy. I heard Monday that Marriott made 150 reservations for the first Sunday open. Everybody was seated on the veranda, so packed, way too many people. Certainly no social distancing there." And Sue, I did hear that as well, and I also heard that the Cayman Bay was packed. A lot of the local bars were packed, way beyond what they should be, given the fact that they're supposed to have tables like a certain distance apart. I'm hoping to get out there. I want to get out there and just have a look around to see exactly what's going on. Carol is saying that they need to close the beaches again for this bank holiday weekend, given the crowds last Sunday. Oh, when is the holiday? Is that this Monday? Okay. George Fullerton says pink eye. Also, anything that is highly contagious, once you have one child in a school environment that has it, it tends to go viral. Because again, children are touching surfaces, they're touching each other, they're touching each other's bags, and you know, it kind of is what it is. So I do believe and think that perhaps we need to be a little bit more cautious. I get the anxiety. I get that people want to get their businesses back open, but I think the alternative of doing it too soon is not something that we're going to be pleased with. And, you know, if we have to revert back to being a complete lockdown after having a taste of our freedom again, in my mind, that has more of a psychological impact on you than if you just stay locked up. I don't know if that makes a whole lot of sense to you guys, but there is definitely some logic to that. So I'm just trying to see what else is going on in the news. So just a reminder that there will be a press conference today. So please tune in for that around 2 o'clock. So now the press conferences are they're only on Tuesdays and Fridays. So this is what it is for the foreseeable future. So we will have to see, you know, if that changes, but it's twice a week now, Tuesdays and Fridays. So tune in for that this afternoon. We will certainly continue to get new information on new results. I think we had something like 7 new cases yesterday. So we're consistently having new positives as more and more people are being tested. The good news is for our population size, we have tested, you know, a fairly decent, I think like 10% of the population, which is considered really, really good. We have one of the highest rate of testing in the world. And I think that that has to continue. Like the more people we test, the more of an idea we can get in terms of where we're at with this disease, you know, how many people are infected, where the infection hotspots are, if there are any, and how we are getting it. So there is this thing about community transmission. We know very much so that we have community transmission in these islands, and some of it is still being imported in as well. So we do have community transmission, but we also have persons who are importing the virus into the Cayman Islands. The few people that are coming in, there's like one case, I think, of someone who was already in quarantine, obviously. And that is why the quarantining situation, I think, works very well, and why it has to be sustained. Because at the end of the day, if you know we reopen and just let people go wherever and do whatever, that is a greater chance of those persons spreading it before they even know that they have it, before they even know that you know they are potentially infectious and or sick. The importance of the 14-day quarantine period is because someone may become symptomatic, and this is kind of where I'm a little like flustered with this whole asymptomatic thing as well. Like at what point in an individual's exposure are they still asymptomatic? So say for example, You test them at day number 10 and they test positive because you just random testing, right? So you wouldn't know because of random tests when they actually picked up the virus. So there's no definitive way to know that. So at day number 10, yes, they may be asymptomatic, but that doesn't mean after you've tested them in another week or so, they're not going to begin to show symptoms. Does that make any sense? So I think that there's a number of variables in this whole thing that the World Health Organization has said that, in my mind, we still need to continue to be very, very cautious about. Um, let's look at some world figures. We haven't done this in a while. So let us see here. All right, so we are now at, whoa, I haven't looked in a couple days and this seems like a significant jump. 7.15 million people worldwide with infections haven't tested positive for coronavirus. Now, of course, we know that that number is actually greater than that. That's on the conservative level. The US remains in the number one spot with 1.96 million confirmed cases and having the most deaths at 111,000. Brazil has moved up significantly and surpassed a number of countries by quite a number. So Brazil now has over 707,000 confirmed cases. And in terms of deaths, they are in third place behind the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom has 40,608 deaths and Brazil has 37,000. And I've been watching the situation with Brazil because this was predicted from over a couple weeks now that Brazil's numbers were really increasing significantly. And there were a number of different reasons for that, including the government's response, basically telling people that, you know, it's not a big deal. And I think this is where a lot of governments have failed their citizens by sending the wrong message out there and not putting measures in place immediately that would have helped to have curtail the spread of the coronavirus and the fallout from that. And of course, poorer countries like Brazil, who already has, a medical system that is struggling, will find it even more challenging and difficult now during these times because the medical system will be inundated with sick people. So infections, top five round out: US, Brazil, Russia is in the third spot. United Kingdom is number four. This is for the number of confirmed cases. And then India has moved up significantly, and they're now in the number five spot. Closely behind them still remains Spain and Italy, which we know at one point Italy had been in the leader position for the number of infections, but now other countries have superseded Italy by a significant number. And I was reading an article, I think it was over the weekend, regarding spikes in the numbers around the world. And it was expected that Latin America and South America were going to see a significant jump in the number of infections. And there were, again, a number of reasons for that. So, in terms of deaths, globally, we have over 407,000. Again, the US remains firmly in first place with over 111. Second is the UK with over 40,000. So you see there's a significant difference. I mean, it's shocking the variance of infections and deaths in the US. I mean, the US has blown everybody else out of the water. And this is not the kind of area that you want to blow people out of the water with. So the UK is in second place with deaths. Then we have Brazil, who's closely behind the UK. I suspect that Brazil will probably overtake the UK soon. France, interestingly enough, France is now in fourth place for the number of deaths. And Spain is now in fifth place. and then Mexico, Belgium. Wait a minute, where's Italy? Did I miss Italy? Oh, I'm sorry. UK, Brazil, Italy, yes, France. So France has surpassed Spain in the number of deaths by a couple thousand, which I find astonishing. Huh. Because, wow, okay. So the numbers have shifted a little bit here. Um, but some increases in Mexico, Chile, Turkey. And again, this only supports the contention that the Cayman Islands will not be in a position to open our borders anytime soon. I mean, honestly, it seems almost impossible, in my opinion, that this is going to be under control within the next year. And then we see things happening like, when there's a reopening of different countries, and it's like a free for all. Like, people don't care. There've been a lot of protesting happening around the world as well, and I'm sure that that is simply not going to help. In the sense that protesters tend to be very close proximity with each other, and they're yelling and spreading whatever they may have into the air, onto surfaces, and onto each other. I support the protests. I'm just saying that one of the natural effects of that will be an increase in the number of infections. But just like over the Memorial Day weekend, last weekend in the US, we saw a jump shortly after that weekend, and the results are continuing to come in because people were at pool parties with literally hundreds of people in the pool together, mingling and doing all sorts of stuff. So it's just astounding and crazy what people are willing to do in the name of fun and expose themselves to. So at least with the protesting, they are trying to accomplish something for a greater good. Jasmine says, missed the show, but as one of the Caymanians left behind, I'll have to watch it later. Yes, Jasmine, I think you'll find what Roy Bodden said this morning to be very interesting, and we will definitely have him back on the program soon. But make sure you tune in tomorrow because we're taking a look at our own genealogical. These words can be tongue twisters. History. Odette says, bar open and not church. Well, I think, Odette, if the bars were adhering to the provisions, I could see from a logical perspective why it would make sense to open a bar restaurant, because most of them are combinations. So most of them, it's not just a bar, but you're actually going in to have a meal, and then they have a bar section. You're not supposed to be sitting at the bar. I mean, there are very, very specific things that were put in place in terms of bars, which unfortunately doesn't sound like a lot of persons are adhering to that. However, if they were adhering to it, it's actually a more controlled and safer environment than the average church. Because think about this, how would you make it work in terms of church, right? Just like funerals, you can only have so many people because it's a confined space. So, what are you going to do with churches? You're going to say, right, same social distancing requirement, so 6 feet apart. Are most pews even 6 feet long? Normally, you're like squished into each other. You would have to limit the number of people that you allow into the church. How are you going to decide who gets into the church and who doesn't? Do deacons get preferential treatment over the regular parishioners? Like, there's just so many complications, I think, with the whole church narrative and the church situation of reopening the churches. And I can understand why a church would probably be one of the last things to reopen. And I don't think it has anything to do with the fact that the government is anti-church or, prefers a bar over a church. They may. I'm not saying that they don't. However, I think logistically there are issues with how a church operates. The other problem with the church is most families go to church together. So then you're what, taking your children to church, or you're going to leave them at home and then you just go to church by yourself? Like, how is that going to work? No touching. So no communion, no handshaking, no hugs in church. So how is all of that going to work? Because you've got to be in a position to maintain the social distancing. And one of the biggest things about going to church, I mean, going to church is like a social experience. So when you go to church, you want to hug your fellow churchgoers. And so, you're going to be asking people to do a lot of things that I think are near impossible to do in that particular environment. People are singing and praising and jumping up and down. And I mean, you can't tell people how to worship. So there's some churches that are a little bit more, um, what's the word I'm looking for? They're a little bit more animated than other churches, and they're like the Pentecostal churches. You know, they believe in jumping and praising and shouting, and all of those things would probably contribute to the spread of coronavirus a little bit more. So I hear what you're saying, and I keep hearing the question about how can you open a bar and not a church? I think logistically they are very, very different things. And the other thing is you can control a bar. Like if you go in there and you see no social distancing, you can say, you know what, we're shutting you down right now today. If the government dared to do that with a church, you'd probably have some kind of mass protest, because that's the only thing we want to protest about. That and gay people, apparently. You'd probably have some sort of mass protest over that type of situation. Like, who's going to be policing every single church? And remember now, churches are big business, whether we want to admit it or not. There are more churches and bars and restaurants in the Cayman Islands than anything else. So who's going to be patrolling, or policing the churches when they reopen? It looks like they're going to have a hard time policing the bars and restaurants as is. The other reason why I think the bars and restaurants have reopened is straight up economics, because bars and restaurants employ people. They employ waiters and waitresses, and those are people in the economy who are going to be now making money, earning a salary, bartenders, cooks in restaurants, etc., who would otherwise be stuck at home and not making a single dime and not having money to put into the economy and therefore relying on government. In churches, there are probably very few people that are getting paid. The pastor, I don't know. Do deacons and stuff get paid? I don't know. But I think that that's a real consideration as well, is the government is being put under pressure by everyone to get the economy going. And so opening bars and restaurants is certainly one way in which to do that. So it's not quite an apples to apples comparison. Seymour Ramsey says, you're so true, Sandy. Churches are way more complicated. Cynthia, thank you for tuning in. Good morning. You have a wonderful day as well. All right, folks. So what else is happening in the Cayman Islands? The Water Authority, good news, has reopened. So now for those of you who still like to go and pay your bills in person, which it's time you get with the program, get online banking, folks. Get it sorted out. This is the time to do it. But the Water Authority has now reopened from 8:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. in Grand Cayman and Cayman Brac, Monday through Friday. The first hour of business is dedicated to the elderly and essential workers. So that's 8:30 to 9:30. So they reopened yesterday. And then they are strictly enforcing the government mandated surname restrictions. So please keep that in mind. You've got to wear a mask, and you'll be provided with hand sanitizer as you enter the building. And you have to adhere to the social distancing markers that are on the floor. Good morning, Lizette. The other interesting thing is the supermarkets, in particular Foster's and, hold on one second. I don't want to tell you the other supermarket incorrectly. So give me one quick second here. I think it's Foster's. I'm going to confirm here. So they are no longer checking your names at the door. So I did go to the supermarket yesterday, which would have been my day to go to grocery shopping. Nobody checked my ID. You're still getting your carts sanitized and so on. So I think this will certainly free up the police service, because they were assisting with some of that, and customs and border control, so they can get back to doing other things. So Foster's and Hurley's no longer require ID. However, Foster's did say, and I don't know if Hurley's has made this announcement yet or not, but Foster's did say that the government's provisions that you travel and that you go out to do these essential things on your name day does remain in place. It's just that they're not going to be checking IDs. So they are asking you to continue to shop on your named day. George says Kirk's is doing it as well. I hadn't heard about Kirk's, but thank you for that information. So it looks like, generally speaking, the grocery stores are not going to be checking your ID, but they're still asking you to, again, keep those things in mind. Still come out on your name day if at all possible. Right. Mm, mhm. Okay. So let me just see what else is going on here. Of course, there continues to be wide protests around the world. We saw, I think it was Bermuda that had a humongous protest over the weekend. I heard some 7,000 people um, turned out. We actually had this story posted. Yeah, some 7,000 persons in Bermuda. I mean, you guys see the photos, they're amazing. Turned out protesting Black Lives Matter. So, this death of George Floyd in the US has really kicked off. I mean, I've never seen anything like it, to be honest. It has really kicked off worldwide protests all over the world, all over Europe, the US, certain parts of the Caribbean, Jamaica, Bermuda. So over 7,000 protesters took to the streets of Hamilton, Bermuda on Sunday as a sign of support for the Black Lives Matter movement. And, we see police departments in the US and governments now saying they will dismantle the police and dismantle funding and put it in other much needed areas to try to support this initiative. So it has been incredibly amazing, some of the positivity that has come out of this. And I want to break it down in this evening show because I think it's important to highlight that what the protesters are doing is actually working. There's been a couple, instances, unfortunately, that have happened. There have been some persons that have lost their lives. There have been, someone showed me an astonishing story where the KKK was marching. I believe that was in Washington. They were actually marching in protest to the protesters, and they got the benefit of a police escort. It's like, only in America does any of that make some sort of sense. So the KKK, a racist organization, a racist group, got the benefit of a police escort. Yeah, it's times like that that you go, you know, America still has a very long ways to go. Unfortunately, it's just crazy. There are times that it just doesn't make any sense to me. Ramsey says, we're always waiting on you, Sandy. Take your time and find the most interesting stories for us. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, so that one I thought this morning when I saw that, I just had to shake my head. Like, there are times when I am even taken aback and I'm surprised by things that happen because I'm just like, what? Like, I have to do a double take and read it again because I think to myself, that can't possibly be what I just read. But indeed, masked white nationalists march in Washington with police escort. The other protesters don't get an escort, but the white nationalists who are hiding their face and who are masked, they actually get the police escort. So it was more than 100 members of the Patriot Front dressed in khaki pants and caps, blue jackets, and white face masks shouted, "Reclaim America" and "Life, Liberty, Victory." Um, and yes, the Southern Poverty Law Center describes the Patriot Front as a white nationalist group that broke off from a similar organization called Vanguard America in the aftermath of the deadly Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017. At that rally, self described neo Nazi James Fields drove his car into a group of protesters, killing a 32-year-old woman by the name of Heather Heyer. And he was convicted of first degree murder and sentenced to life in prison in 2008. US President Trump drew criticism from his fellow Republicans as well as Democrats for saying that both sides were to blame for the deadly 27 incident. Good old President Trump. You can always expect him to stoke the flames of racism, quite obviously. So that was one of the more interesting stories I saw this morning that made me shake my head in disbelief. And GoFundMe suspends Candace Owen after she trashes George Floyd. So apparently this is a Black woman I haven't really been following. I've heard her name, but I haven't really been following that story. So maybe I'll have a read of that and then bring that up to you guys for this evening's program. So yeah, they've been a very interesting number of things. They have found a man, 24, and he's being charged with murder of retired St. Louis police captain David Dern, who's 77. I think that was in the news last week, that he was trying to protect his friend's store and lost his life in the by some looters. And so, of course, now they have someone charged with that. So very good. It's sad that it is a Black man, but justice hopefully will be served in that instance. There's been a couple of viral videos that have been, shown. There's a lady, I think, in a gas station or something, telling someone to go back to where she came from. The only problem with that is the woman was saying, actually, I'm Native American, so we were here before you were. So I'm not quite sure where you want me to go back to. You came here from somewhere else. And this can be, I think, the ignorance of people that is really, really sad. One final note about the looters. A lot of them looted a store, an Apple store. I can't remember the exact location, but when I saw it on the news, they were showing the live footage of it. I thought to myself, these people are obviously stupid, because nobody loots an Apple store because you'll never be able to use the devices. I mean, Apple has their devices locked down with some seriously tight security. So at the time it happened, I kind of chuckled to myself. I'm like, well, that's not an Android, that's not a Samsung. And sure enough, iPhone has been not just locking those stolen devices, but they have actually been helping to apprehend these individuals by tracking them. So I said, you can imagine, you can very well track these phones even before they are sold to an owner. So I'm just trying to see where this story is at. There's a number of things trending right now with Apple because I think they're pushing out some new update and some other things. But yeah, they've actually been tracking these devices with a view to finding the culprits. So iPhone looters find devices disabled with a warning that they're being tracked. So Apple sent a message on the phone. So again, these people are not the brightest, but some of them went into a store in, I'm just trying to remember the exact location of this retail store. But anyway, they sold a bunch of Apple products, including iPhones. I guess they thought, oh yes, I'll just put in my SIM card and turn it on, I'll be good to go. Well, not so fast, says Apple. So they've had a number of their stores, I think, broken into, and people have taken their devices. And Tim Cook, who is the CEO of Apple, sent a message to his employees that said, there's a pain deeply etched in the soul of our nation and in the hearts of millions. To stand together, we must stand up for one another and recognize the fear, the hurt, and outrage rightfully provoked by the senseless killing of George Floyd and a much longer history of racism. However, that does not mean that they're going to permit you to take advantage of them. So what they have done is they've actually taken the decision to close the majority of their US stores for the safety of their staff and its customers. Because of course, Apple devices are a high ticket electronic item that a lot of people would love to get their hands on. And Unfortunately, it was one of those situations where some of them had just reopened after the COVID-19 shutdown. However, they have closed more stores, and they have become, it says here, favored target of looters given the likely spoils on offer. And the decision was taken to remove stock from shop floors and shutter locations. And so they had done like a Twitter announcement of what stores would be closed on what particular date. So they had Washington, D.C., a hit in Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, California, San Francisco, California, New York, and Philadelphia, where looters were seen stealing whatever products were accessible at the time. Taking a boxed iPhone from one of the retail stores. However, it has long been known that Apple operates some form of proximity software that disables a device when it is taken illegally from a store. So, not too smart there, looters. Until now, though, little had been seen of the technology in action because no one was really stealing devices quite like that. They would steal them from like the end user, not directly from Apple. So Apple says, "Aha! Thanks to social media, we can now see that the message that greets a looter powering up their device says this device has been disabled and is being tracked. It says local authorities will be alerted." And the funniest thing is, people are actually posting these messages on social media of what the phone says. So this one phone was posted on Twitter, says, "Please return to Apple Walnut Street." So it even tells you the location that you took the phone from and where you need to return it. And this device has been disabled and is being tracked. And this article goes on to say, quite tongue in cheek, that it is unlikely any of these devices will be returned to stores as requested, but that's not the point. They'll be stripped for parts. They may be stripped for parts. More likely, they'll be quickly dumped over fears there's some form of tracking in place. And this is Apple after all, and they are very good at tracking their devices. Um, so it says looting apart, the theft of high-end phones with iPhones top of the list have been an issue in major cities for years. And Apple has taken steps after step to try to render its devices worthless once taken, including the sticky Find My functionality that enables users to track down their iPhone if your device goes missing. Put it in lock mode to lock it immediately and start tracking its location. And that's one of the reasons that I personally love Apple devices, and I have been an Apple user for a very long time. I've never actually had a phone stolen, but I've known of other people who have, and I was always quite amazed, to be honest, when uh, back a couple years ago, people would be stealing phones and stuff. And I always thought, why are the telecom companies not doing a better job? Because they can do stuff as well. They can trace phones by the what's that number called, the IDME number or whatever. They can trace those numbers. And so when you go in and you go into like another retailer and you're trying to, or you have to go in to get a local SIM card, they could be tracing that information to see if that's a stolen phone. But listen, Apple has done a great job in making sure that their devices are not easy to get your hands on if you're not the proper owner of the device. Because even if you have an Apple device and you've stolen it from somebody else and you've wiped the phone and you try to resell it, when it comes back up, if you've not done it properly with the proper login credentials, it reverts back to the login credentials of whoever was on the phone previously. So a lot of people do not know that these things are available on an Apple phone if you're not an Apple user. I think Apple has done a fantastic job, and there's a couple of years ago where they really locked down the phones and it dropped Apple thefts by like 60% or 70% or something ridiculous. Because people are like, well, what's the point of you stealing a phone that I can't use? Yeah, there's always the possibility of like taking it apart and stripping it down for parts, but most people are not in the business of trying to sell Apple parts. They just want the phone. So yeah, that's fantastic. And there was a scam here for the longest time. I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but people would take Apple phones that they'd stolen, and then they would take them to the local pawn shop, and they would pawn them, pretending like it was their phone, of course. And they would say, oh, yeah, I want to pawn this device or I want to sell this device or whatever. And even if they get a fraction of, they get a couple $100 for a $1,200 phone, they don't care because it's not their phone. Or they would pretend like it's their phone and say, okay, I'm going to borrow some money against this. Maybe you'd get, because the pawn shops don't give you full value in anything, not even close. So you might get 20 or 30% of what the item is actually valued at, right? So you pawn it and you get that. That's like free money for you because you're going to default on the loan, right? On the it's a loan. You're going to default on the loan from the pawn shop, and then they're going to have a phone that is entirely useless to them. Nothing they can do. So they didn't know that, and at one point they had to start actually powering up every single iPhone that people would bring in so that they could check it and have you unlock it and just make sure that it was legitimately yours. Because for a while they would have people bringing in and pawning phones they had stolen, was in their phone. They would default on what was borrowed and the phone was useless. So it's not like the pawn shop could then turn around and sell the phone to anyone else because they couldn't get into it. So it was a whole scam for a bit there. Um, so that's what it is. All right, folks, I'm going to wrap this up. I've got some important things I definitely got to do today. Please continue to tune in. We got the press conference again this afternoon. We do have an evening show. So we'll be back at 7 o'clock. Lizette wants to know if the water companies check in for IDs. Based on the fact that they said that they are going by the ID system, I'm assuming that they will be checking for IDs. And they do have a security guard there. So that's probably quite easy for them to do. And I would just say, you know, get the online thing going, folks. It really does save you a lot of time and resources as opposed to actually having to go into a physical location. You can pay all of your bills online. All right, folks, please be safe today. Have a wonderful day. And we'll be back here this evening. First of all, 2 o'clock for the press conference, and then again at 7 p.m. for the evening segment. Take care, and we'll see you a bit later on.